Hello, I'm Hannah Cole. This is Still Unanswered, a podcast about long-term missing person cases and the families who live with open endings. Today's episode is about the disappearance of a little boy named Timmothy Pitzen. This story stretches from an ordinary Midwestern morning to a motel room where his mother took her own life 3 days later. The case remains unsolved. It's heavy, it's complicated, and I want to say at the start, we'll move slowly today. We will talk about facts, timelines, the people involved, and the many theories that have been raised over the years. But we will also try to hold some space for the grief and the ethical questions that hang over this case. With me is Dr. Marcus Ellison. Marcus is a clinical psychologist who consults with law enforcement on family systems, suicidality, and parental abduction dynamics. He's worked on cases like this and brings a clinician's perspective to the emotional and behavioral patterns we see. Marcus, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Hannah. I'm glad to be here. This case, it's one that stays with people, and I appreciate the careful tone you've set.
By the way, before we get into the timeline, listener warning. We'll be discussing suicide, possible child harm, and the emotional fallout for families. If any of that is difficult for you, please take care. Okay, let's begin with the anchor facts, who Timothy was and where this all starts. Timothy James Pitzen was born October 18, 2004, in Aurora, Illinois. He was 6 years old in May 2011. He loved trains and water parks, according to family accounts. A typical, energetic kindergarten kid from Greenman Elementary. He lived with his parents, Jim and Amy Pitzen. On May 11, 2011, Jim dropped Timothy at school in the morning. That same morning, between about 8:10 and 8:15 a.m., Amy arrived at the school and checked him out, telling staff there was a family emergency.
Right. And that early removal is an important behavioral detail. It signals agency. Someone making a deliberate decision to take a child out of their routine environment. It doesn't, in itself, tell us why she did it, but the fact is, she did.
Exactly. Over the next 3 days, May 11 to May 14, Amy and Timothy traveled. They visited places like Brookfield Zoo, Key Lime Cove in Gurnee, and then up to the Kalahari Resort in Wisconsin Dells. Surveillance footage shows them calm, together at those resorts. On May 13th, security camera footage at the Kalahari is the last confirmed sighting of Timothy alive. After that, no verified sightings.
And also, Hannah, it's worth noting that in the hours after they left Kalahari, there are calls Amy makes that are geographically tied to the area, northwestern Illinois, Sterling and Rock Falls. Those calls are important because they're one of the last times we have audio evidence of Timothy being present. He's reportedly audible in the background asking for food.
Yes. Around noon to 1:30 p.m. on May 13th, Amy called her mother and her brother-in-law. In those calls, she told them she and Timothy were fine and not in any danger. And in the background, a child's voice, that of Timothy, can be heard saying he was hungry. Then, evening footage in Winnebago shows Amy alone, buying notepaper, envelopes, and a pen at a Family Dollar, and later at a grocery store. No sign of Timothy on any of that footage.
This gap, the long window between early afternoon when the child is audibly present and the evening when she appears alone on camera, is, from a behavioral analysis standpoint, one of the most challenging parts of the case. It creates a large, ambiguous time frame where multiple courses of action could have occurred.
Right. And then on May 14, at about 12:30 p.m., a hotel housekeeper found Amy dead in a room at the Rockford Inn. She had died by suicide. There were suicide notes. In one note, she wrote that Timothy was safe, that he was with people who would care for him, and, this line has haunted many people, "You will never find him." The vehicle, Amy's SUV, was parked outside. Investigators later found traces of soil and plant material on it and blood on the back seat that initial reports later said belonged to Timothy, but the suicide knife had only Amy's blood.
The forensics detail you mentioned is important. The presence of blood in a vehicle is alarming in any disappearance, but lab analysis matters. In this case, investigators and family members have indicated that the child's blood could be explained by a nosebleed he'd experienced earlier in the month, and the knife only had the mother's DNA. That doesn't resolve questions, but it does complicate certain narratives.
Marcus, before we move deeper into the theories, can you unpack for listeners what kinds of psychological states or family dynamics can lead to something like this? A parent taking a child and then killing themselves, or else disappearing with them. I want to be careful here. We aren't diagnosing, but what patterns should listeners understand?
Yeah, I appreciate that caution, Hannah. There are a few patterns we see, clinically and in casework. One is severe depression with psychosis or overwhelming hopelessness, where a parent believes the world is unsafe or that the child would be better off removed from a perceived threat. Another is acute fear of losing custody, which can provoke desperate acts, sometimes called custodial interference or parental abduction motivated by anticipated legal loss. Then there are rarer, tragic situations where a parent intends a murder-suicide. But it's important to say it's not one size fits all. People with long histories of mental illness, like Amy reportedly had, can have episodes that don't fit tidy categories.
Listeners will have heard the phrase family annihilation in true crime contexts. Is that what's being implied here, or is that too sensational?
Family annihilation is a loaded term and usually refers to a parent killing entire family units. In the Pitzen case, there's no evidence of domestic homicide beyond the mother's suicide, so using that label would be premature. What we can say is that previous suicide attempts and acute custody fears raise the risk of extreme acts. But again, the absence of confirmed physical harm to Timothy complicates definitive conclusions. We have to hold uncertainty.
Uncertainty. That phrase keeps returning in this case. Let's walk the timeline slowly, with detail, because the small movements matter. May 11. Amy checks out Timothy from school. She takes him to Brookfield Zoo after dropping the car at a shop. Then, that afternoon, they go to Key Lime Cove in Gurney. Surveillance shows them there on May 11, around 3:15 p.m. Calm. They stayed overnight. Any points to add there, Marcus?
I would add that the actions on May 11, the zoo, the water park, on the surface seem like a mother packing a child off for a short, fun trip. That outward normalcy is typical in some planned abductions or custodial takeaways. It can also be part of someone trying to create memory-laden last days. People don't always behave in ways that match their internal crisis. Normal activities can mask deep disturbance.
By the way, that detail about Amy returning to similar routes in the days before the trip Investigators later found she had driven similar routes twice before, which suggests pre-planning. That's in the record. It doesn't tell us what she intended to do at those locations, but it suggests she was scouting. Then, May 12, they arrive at Kalahari in Wisconsin Dells. Footage there the next morning, around 10 a.m., is the last confirmed sighting of Timothy. After checkout, they head south back into Illinois.
And that's where the cell phone pings become critical. Between noon and around 1:30 p.m. on May 13th, Amy places calls to her mother and to Jim's brother. She tells them all is fine. Timothy is audible. That gives us a window with a timestamp. But then later that evening, surveillance in Winnebago shows Amy alone. So what happened between roughly 1:30 p.m. and 7 p.m. that day?
It's a big, gaping question. Investigators searched areas around Sterling and Rock Falls because of where the phones were used. On May 19, more than 70 people joined organized searches. Nothing turned up. And then Amy is captured on camera at Family Dollar at 7:25 p.m. buying pen and envelopes, and at 8 p.m. at a grocery store, still alone. She then checks into Rockford Inn around 11:15 p.m., alone. The next afternoon, the housekeeper finds her dead.
Listeners, that stretch of day is where most theories try to explain the unobserved events. And it's worth noting, from an investigatory standpoint, trace evidence, like soil on a car, can give leads. But in rural and agricultural regions, there are many places that could match general plant types and minerals, so tying trace samples to a specific site is often challenging without a direct comparator.
Which is exactly what happened here. Police sent samples to labs, but could not definitively match them to a particular field or riverbank. They did, in 2013, recover Amy's missing phone off a rural highway in northwestern Illinois, but officials said it didn't produce new actionable leads. I want to linger on the suicide note language for a moment, because it has been quoted widely, and because it frames so much of how people interpret her actions. He is safe. They will care for him. You will never find him. Marcus, how do we read a note like that from a psychological perspective?
Notes are complex artifacts. Sometimes people who plan to leave a child with others will say he's safe to reassure themselves or family. Other times, a person leaving ambiguous instructions may write messages intended to control the narrative or inflict emotional pain. It's also possible for someone in a compromised mental state to tell themselves a comforting story. I've placed him where he'll be okay, even if the reality is unknown. We can't attribute motive purely from wording. But emotionally, that line, "you will never find him," has immense pain for the family. It reads not only as finality, but as an attempt to close a future the family might otherwise hold open.
Yeah, and the family, Jim, Kara, and Alana, have all spoken publicly over the years. Jim has said he doesn't believe Amy killed their son. He keeps Timothy's room largely unchanged and has maintained hope. Amy's sister Kara and her mother Alana have also resisted the idea that Amy would murder Timothy, though they acknowledge her history of mental illness and prior suicide attempt. That division between forensic possibilities and family belief is wrenching.
It's important to recognize that families often protect an image of someone they loved, even when that person did something unthinkable. We see that repeatedly in missing person cases involving a parent. Survivor loyalty isn't about blind denial. It's also about identity, memory, and a need to preserve the child's presence in a world that suddenly lacks them.
Let's talk about the investigations after 2011. There were searches, surveillance videos released to the public, dozens of tips a year. Early on, investigators said they were getting about 5 tips a month. And then, in 2013, the phone was found. Trace evidence remained inconclusive. The case stayed classified as a missing person investigation rather than a homicide because there's no proof of death. Then, in 2019, something happened that reopened national attention. A man claiming to be Timothy.
Yes, that was the Brian Riney episode. On April 3, 2019, police in Newport, Kentucky, were called about a disoriented young man who claimed he'd escaped kidnappers and said his name was Timmothy Pitzen. He told officers he'd been held since 2012 and described 2 captors and details about where he'd been. Initially, with media moving fast, people allowed themselves hope.
But within a day, DNA testing confirmed he was not Timothy. He was Brian Michael Riney, then 23, with a criminal history and a pattern of making false claims. He was later charged federally for making false statements and served time. For the family, the incident was devastating, reliving the trauma and then losing hope again when the claim collapsed. Kara called it like reliving that day all over again. Alana, the grandmother, said it was exhausting.
The Riney episode brings up several ethical and emotional issues: the speed of media coverage before verification, the psychological need of families to cling to any possibility, and the harm hoaxes do. There's also a broader issue. Some people, with their own trauma histories, may impersonate victims for attention or because they have complex motives. Either way, it's cruel and it wastes investigative resources.
Let's step through the major theories the public and investigators have considered. We have several. 1, that Amy killed Timothy and concealed his body. 2, that she rehomed him with another family or community. 3, that a stranger abducted him during the trip. And 4, a more speculative angle about an interrupted murder-suicide plan. We'll walk each theory and separate evidence-based points from conjecture. Marcus, are you okay to do that with me?
Yes. Let's go through them carefully.
Theory 1. Amy killed Timothy and concealed his body. Evidence 4 includes the presence of blood in the car and the multi-hour window on May 13th where no one saw the child. There's also the ominous language in the note. Evidence against: the family says the blood likely came from a nosebleed earlier. The suicide knife only had Amy's DNA, and no body or personal effects have been found despite many searches. Marcus, from a behavioral perspective, how often do parents who commit filicide leave clear statements like, "You will never find him"?
That's a tough question because motives vary widely. Some perpetrators leave statements that reveal intent, others do not. Saying, "You will never find him," could be read several ways: a confession, a taunt, an attempt to spare others the task of searching, or a delusional belief that the child is safe elsewhere. Without other corroborating evidence, it's hard to interpret conclusively. For investigators, absence of a body makes it difficult to move from suspicion to charges.
Theory 2. Amy secretly rehomed Timothy, maybe with people in an insular religious community, perhaps even a Mormon commune, as some family members have speculated publicly. Arguments for this: her note said he was safe and will be cared for. She may have scouted rural areas. It would explain why he hasn't been found. Arguments against: investigators and family have not identified a candidate caretaking family, and anyone knowingly harboring a missing child would risk serious criminal consequences. Marcus, what are the psychological implications for a child raised under a new identity in a closed community?
If that were the case, and emphasize if, the child could develop a normal life superficially, but later learning his origin story could be profoundly destabilizing. Identity formation in adolescence and early adulthood could be disrupted by sudden revelations. There are also legal and moral consequences for whoever aided such rehoming. From the mother's standpoint, if she believed she was protecting the child from a perceived threat, she may have thought this was a solution. But again, that's speculation tied to motive.
Theory 3. Stranger or opportunistic abduction. The argument here is that public stops and multiple locations created opportunities where a third party could have snatched Timothy without Amy's intention. For this theory, we have no direct evidence, no witnesses, no suspicious persons on camera, no physical trace indicating a transfer. So investigators generally consider it possible, but lacking proof. Marcus, statistically speaking, how common are stranger abductions compared to parental abductions?
Theory 3. Stranger or opportunistic abduction. The argument here is that public stops and multiple locations created opportunities where a third party could have snatched Timothy without Amy's intention. For this theory, we have no direct evidence, no witnesses, no suspicious persons on camera, no physical trace indicating a transfer. So investigators generally consider it possible, but lacking proof. Marcus, statistically speaking, how common are stranger abductions compared to parental abductions?
In the U.S., most missing child cases that result from abductions are family abductions, commonly by a parent. Stranger abductions of children are relatively rare. That said, rare doesn't mean impossible. The mother traveling with a child does increase the number of potential encounters, but again, there's no concrete evidence pointing to a stranger in this case.
Theory 4, more speculative, that Amy planned a murder-suicide or a pact, but maybe changed her mind, or staged a rehoming to feel less guilty. There's little direct evidence for that, and it's a harder theory to defend. But people have raised it because of the suicide attempt history and the eventual suicide. Marcus, what do investigators and clinicians consider when evaluating such a possibility?
They look for prior statements, planning behaviors, purchases that might indicate lethal intent, and forensic evidence. In the Pitzen case, we see the purchase of notepaper and envelopes and the presence of medication. Suicide attempts in the past raise risk, but they don't prove that she intended to kill the child. It's a set of possibilities, none proven. Clinically, the combination of pre-planning, attempts to reassure family, and the final act complicates interpretation.
I want to take a moment and talk about the human toll here. Jim Pitzen, Timothy's father, has spoken publicly. He does not believe Amy killed their son, and he continues to hope Timothy is alive. Amy's sister Kara talks about Amy's mental illness and her fears about custody. Grandmother Alana speaks about never stopping hope and imagines possibilities like Timothy being raised in an insular religious community without access to media. The Rainey hoax in 2019 reopened wounds. It was like reliving the day. Marcus, how do families sustain hope for so long in the face of ambiguity?
Hope and ambiguity are often intertwined. Hope can be protective. It allows people to keep functioning, to make meaning, to continue searching. At the same time, unresolved loss leads to complicated grief, where the absence of closure prevents the normal grief tasks. Families may oscillate between activism, actively seeking the missing person, and private preservation, keeping rooms as they were, maintaining rituals. This is adaptive in many ways, but also burdensome long-term.
Listeners, one of the consistent features of this case is the public's re-engagement at certain moments. Anniversary coverage, age-progressed photos from NCMEC, and false sighting alerts like the one in 2019. The NCMEC released age-progressed images to imagine what Timothy might look like as he grew, first to show him at 9, later as a teenager, and so on. Those images keep cases visible, but they aren't a replacement for certainty. Marcus, when investigators release age-progressed photos, what do they hope to achieve, and what are the pitfalls?
The hope is practical. A face in a current photograph might prompt someone who recognizes the person to come forward. The pitfalls include false sightings and the emotional swing for families when an unconfirmed sighting gets media attention. Age-progressed images can be useful, but they're estimates. Facial structure changes, lifestyle, and even ethnicity markers can appear different over time. They are investigative tools, not guarantees.
Let's pause and do a quiet scene work for listeners, painting places described in police reports and family recollections. Picture Key Lime Cove, indoor tropical murals, slides, families in bathing suits, the excited shrieks of kids. Picture Kalahari, elephant statues, thatched decor, long checkout lines. Picture Route 40 and Sterling, flat farmland, creeks, 2-lane highways, places where a car could be briefly pulled off out of sight. Picture Winnebago's Family Dollar under fluorescent lights. Picture the Rockford Inn, external room doors, a parking lot right outside the room. Picture Jim's house in Aurora with a child's bedroom left almost untouched, train sets on the floor, drawings on the wall. These domestic images contrast sharply with the mystery.
Thank you for that, Hannah. Those images remind us how ordinary so many of the settings are. That ordinariness is part of what makes it so painful. The intersections of everyday life and extraordinary tragedy.
I want to address an important, painful truth: the Risney hoax. In April 2019, when a man claiming to be Timothy appeared in Newport, Kentucky, the media and public allowed a lot of hope to surface. DNA testing quickly disproved the claim. Risney was later convicted and sentenced. For the Pitzen family, it was... Marcus, what word do you use?
Devastating. The reopening of hope, however brief, creates emotional turmoil. It's corrosive precisely because it plays on their most vulnerable and persistent desire, that their child might come home.
And the broader ethical question: should media wait to confirm DNA results before presenting hopeful narratives? On one hand, when you cover a potential live rescue, it's news. On the other hand, the family endures public hope and humiliation when claims collapse. How do you balance that?
There's no easy answer. Ethically, journalists should be transparent about verification status and the range of possible outcomes. Families deserve sensitivity. In practice, newsrooms race, and social media amplifies unverified claims. Responsibility lies across institutions, media, law enforcement, and also consumers of news. But we must acknowledge the human cost when stories turn out to be hoaxes.
Listeners, some of you follow missing person cases professionally or personally. One practical note: the Aurora Police Department and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children remain the official points of contact. The case remains open. Any credible tip, however small, should be directed to those agencies. Marcus, when a case crosses a decade marker, when the missing child becomes an adult, what shifts in an investigation?
Several things shift. Investigators may pursue fresh lines, checking for records of identity fraud, monitoring online activity, or following tips from changed witnesses. They may pursue end-of-life patterns for the missing person, colleges, military service records, employment. Age progression becomes more important. Also, the motivation set changes. A parent who abducted might become more anxious that the child will find them and reveal the truth, or, conversely, their guilt may deepen. Each decade complicates memory and evidence, but doesn't close the door.
I want to make sure we devote time to the emotional themes that this case brings up. The cruelty of ambiguity, not knowing whether your child is dead or alive. The tension between compassion for a parent with mental illness and anger at the harm inflicted. The ethics of rehoming a child, if that happened. And the passage of time. Timothy, if alive today, would be in his early 20s. The small person in a kindergarten uniform becomes a complicated adult identity no age progression can fully capture.
People often underestimate how ambiguous losses linger. They interrupt normal mourning processes and can cause chronic hypervigilance in families. There's also a social toll. People around the family may retreat because they don't know what to say. Sustained attention over many years is emotionally exhausting, and hoaxes or false sightings exacerbate that fatigue.
I want to ask you, Marcus, a question about empathy. How do we talk about someone like Amy in a way that holds both accountability and compassion? She's a mother who died by suicide, who had a documented history of mental illness and a prior attempt. Her note either promised safety or hid a terrible truth. How do families and communities reconcile those things?
It's one of the hardest conversations. Compassion towards someone with mental illness doesn't erase the real harm done. Families can grieve both a loved one and the loss they caused. Mental illness can explain behavior without excusing it. Publicly, many people try to hold both truths, that someone was suffering and that an enormous wrong occurred. That duality is messy, and it's okay for people to feel contradictory emotions, anger, grief, pity, simultaneously.
Listeners, I want us to step back to the most practical elements of this case, what investigators looked for and what remains unknown. Investigators examined Amy's car, found soil and plant material suggesting it had been parked off-road near a stream. They tested the blood on the back seat. They recovered Amy's missing phone in 2013, but said it provided no new leads. They did wide area searches near Sterling and Rock Falls and around places Amy's phone pinged, but no child, no body, no confirmed whereabouts beyond those early calls. As of this recording, the case remains unsolved.
One more thing on the investigative challenge. When an investigation lacks a crime scene connected to the missing child, there are legal and resource limitations. Agencies have to allocate manpower to follow credible tips, which over time can decrease. Cold case units sometimes pick up new forensic technologies or fresh witness recollections, but often it's an accumulation of small tips that matters.
Let's address some listener questions we anticipated based on prior episodes and comments. 1. Is it common for a parent's suicide to be followed by a missing child who is never found? The answer, it's rare, but not unheard of. Each case is different. 2. Could Timothy have been given to an orphanage or new family under false documentation? That would require additional people to be complicit. 3. Are there any credible ongoing leads? Law enforcement publicly says they still receive tips and treat the case as open. They urge anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward.
And to add, some leads come in years later from mundane sources: a neighbor recognizing a photo, a social worker seeing a name in records. That's why persistence matters.
We promised in the opening to hold space for emotional weight. I want to read a short excerpt, paraphrased, from statements family members have made over the years, because their voices matter in this narrative. Jim has described living each day with a hole. Kara has described the fear that Amy's mental illness contributed to an irreversible decision. Alana has described never stopping hope and imagining distant possibilities. These are real humans carrying this uncertainty every day.
Please, Hannah, also remind listeners of the real human costs when hoaxes occur. It isn't just a news cycle. It's a rewounding.
Yes, when Brian Rennie came forward claiming to be Timothy, it forced the family through a media frenzy and an immediate spike of attention that ended in disappointment and anger. That was cruel, whether he acted out of delusion or malice. The case exposed how quickly public hope can be raised and how quickly it can be dashed. We're about 3/4 of the way through today's episode. I want to slow down and let you, Marcus, go into a bit more detail about parental abduction dynamics and how law enforcement and mental health professionals might overlap in such investigations. Then we'll close with what listeners can do if they have information and a final reflection.
Okay, from the behavioral standpoint, parental abductions often happen in the context of escalating custody disputes or when one parent fears losing the child. Some parents plan carefully, scouting routes, identifying safe houses, choosing times of low likelihood of detection. Others act impulsively. In investigations, we look for signs of pre-planning: repeated scouting drives, purchases that support movement, the removal of identifying documents, or contact with individuals who could facilitate rehoming. Clinicians provide insight into motive and risk, helping law enforcement understand how a parent might act under severe distress. But there are limits. We can't read minds. Our role is to interpret behavior and to support family members who are surviving ambiguous loss. It's also common to coordinate with protective services if there is reason to believe a child is in a situation of ongoing risk.
In the Pitzen case, investigators documented some pre-trip drives, Amy's history of mental health struggles, and the midday calls that placed the mother and child in northern Illinois during that window. They also found soil on the SUV consistent with time spent off-road. But again, no definitive physical proof connecting any site to a child's remains. No confirmed post-2011 sighting. Marcus, do you think there is a plausible path forward that could actually resolve the case at this point?
It's possible. Cases have been solved decades later through DNA matches, unexpected witness recollections, or people coming forward with new information out of conscience. Technology improves, databases expand, and people change. Someone who once helped conceal a child might later decide to reveal the truth. But realistically, it's also possible this remains unresolved. That's the painful part.
Listeners, if you have any information, no matter how long ago, please contact the Aurora Police Department or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There are official channels. If you think you may have seen age-progressed images resembling someone you know, report it. Law enforcement treats every credible tip seriously.
And for anyone grieving an ambiguous loss, reach out for support. There are groups specifically for families of missing persons and for those coping with complicated grief. You don't have to carry it alone.
We're wrapping up. Marcus, before we close, anything you want to say to the listeners about how to hold both the human emotion and the investigative complexity of a case like this?
Yes. Hold both, the human tragedy and the nuance of evidence. It's entirely reasonable to feel anger, bewilderment, sorrow, and compassion all at once. When discussing cases publicly, aim for empathy for the family and restraint from premature conclusions. And if you're someone with information, even small, it matters. Cases are often solved by ordinary-seeming tips that, when linked, produce a breakthrough.
Thank you, Marcus. This case is so heavy because it refuses a neat ending. Amy's final act left a sentence unfinished, a child's life, and a family missing their center. Timothy would be in his early 20s now. We don't know what he looks like, what he thinks, or if he knows who he is. We only know the trace evidence, the phone pings, the surveillance clips, the suicide notes, and the family's refusal to let their son disappear from memory. If you're listening and this has brought up something for you, memories, questions, pain, please take a moment after the episode to breathe, to step outside, to call a friend. There are resources in the episode notes. For those who want to help in practical ways, the Aurora Police Department and NCMEC are the official contacts for tips. If you have a small detail to share, a recollection of seeing a car at a particular time near a farm road, a memory of someone mentioning a child with a certain background, please report it. Investigations are puzzles built of tiny pieces.
And Hannah, one last thought. For families living with still unanswered cases, attention matters. It can be both painful and useful. Keep following responsibly.
We will. Thank you for listening to Still Unanswered. Thank you, Marcus, for your time. We'll include source materials and contact information in the episode notes. If you have tips about this case or others, please reach out to the official hotlines. We'll be back with another episode soon. Good night.
Good night, Hannah.